great number in the US who don't like the idea of global warming because it might mean that we have to change the way we do business. It might mean that we have to change the way we burn fuel. It might mean we have to change the way that we heat our houses and things like that. And people don't want to hear that. So it's easier just to say, see, we had a really cold winter. There's no global warming. That's a myth of science. That's a terrible problem. And we face it. How do we know how science works? Well, it turns out that there are 4 disciplines. There are 4 groups of scholars, if you will, who are studying scientists. Scientists do not study themselves. They're too busy doing science. This makes sense to me. So other people step back and look in. They look in at science and describe how science functions. Of course, the history of science teaches us quite a lot about how science works. The philosophy of science teaches us quite a lot about how science works. Sociology of science, a small group of scholars who do go into laboratories and they study scientists at work. It must be very strange for the scientists, because the scientists are studying rats and the sociologists are studying them. Not sure how they feel about this, but this is what a sociologist of science might do. And then we also have a group of psychologists who are very interested in the way that humans make observations. It turns out that our ability to observe the world has more to do with what we already think than what we see. That's an important element of the nature of science, and I'll get to that too. So here's this list again. There it is. Apparently we have a little extra time today, so I could fill it by going around to every single one of you saying, what about hypothesis is just an educated guess? What about hypothesis becomes theory and a theory becomes a law? We could go through every single one of these. But it's so much easier for me just to push this button. They're all wrong. Every single one of these ideas that people, many people, not you, you're a very special audience, I recognize that, but a great number of people would think that many of these things are true, and none of them are true. So let's have some fun for the next little while. Let's take each one of these at a time and just talk about them a little bit. Some of them are fairly straightforward, some of them are fairly complicated. It's a very common thing in American schools, very common, for the teacher to say to students, make a hypothesis. Do you do that in Turkey? Do you ask the students to make a hypothesis?
Some teachers, sometimes.
Sometimes, yeah. There's nothing wrong with it, except I don't know what the word hypothesis means. This is the problem. It turns out in the literature, the word hypothesis has at least 3 separate meanings. And the meanings are kind of subtle. For those of you who came to the panel discussion before lunch, you heard me say several times, I think science is so special that we need to make sure that people understand it. And math is special, and engineering is special. This is why I don't like the idea of just mixing them all up in some fashion so that they lose their special identity. The way in which we use the word hypothesis has at least 3 meanings in science, because of the way in which the word has been used through history. Let's take a look. It could be a prediction. So you could say to students, I want you to predict what's going to happen. And you know what I would love for you to do? Just tell the students to make a prediction. Don't use the word hypothesis anymore. Because the word hypothesis has 2 more meanings. It could be an immature theory. A baby theory. Or it could be, you know where I'm going now, don't you? It could be an immature law, a baby law. And theories and laws are so different from each other that I don't want students to think, oh, it's a hypothesis, it could be anything. It could be a bunny, it could be an elephant, we have good words, and I think the word prediction works pretty well. If you don't want to get into the argument of whether it's a baby theory or whether it's a baby law, then to say to students, you're going to mix these 2 chemicals together, what do you think is going to happen? What is your prediction? There's nothing, that's perfectly fine from an educational and philosophical perspective. So, let me talk about this a different way. The word hypothesis may mean a baby law. It's a generalization that you think might be true if you could test it more. It could grow up to become a law. It might become a law. Or it could be, as I've said, a baby theory with more data. This explanatory hypothesis, please notice how I'm using the word, explanatory versus generalizing. This baby theory could grow up to become, an important scientific theory. But look what is linking these two. What do you see linking those two? It's a trick question. Nothing. Theories and laws are the most important things that scientists create. Theories do not become laws. They are separate. They're very important. They are related to each other, but one does not become the other. This is a very common myth of science, as you'll hear me say in a minute. And then, of course, to fill in the middle, the word hypothesis might just be a simple prediction, and if so, just call it that. Laws and theories are very special kinds of scientific knowledge. A law is a generalization, a principle, or a relationship. For instance, the law of gravity. The law of gravity. You can do all kinds of things with the law of gravity. One of the things you might like to do is explain why it works. Even Isaac Newton never wrote a scientific paper about the theory of gravity. He wrote about the law of gravity. He understood the relationship of distance and mass. And with those two things, you could figure out the gravitational attraction. There's a wonderful story about an astronaut. On one of the US Apollo programs, there were 3 astronauts headed to the moon. And they were all on camera at the same time during a live news broadcast. And the news reporter said, "Who's flying that thing? Who's flying the space capsule? There are 3 guys, you're all on camera, nobody's steering." And one of the astronauts said, "Newton." See, once you know the direction and the mass and the distance and you factor all that in, the spacecraft is headed in that particular direction without anyone having to steer it, without anyone having to drive the spaceship. But one of the things that Isaac Newton never had, and we still don't really have, is a theory of gravity. Why does gravity work the way it does? Now, it turns out that in Newton's private writings, he proposed a theory of gravity. He suggested that gravity was evidence of the hand of God. That's pretty impressive. It's pretty impressive that he didn't put that in his scientific writings, and the reason he didn't put it in his scientific writings is it's a non-scientific idea. And he was a genius, as we know, and recognized there were things that science could talk about, and there were things that science, because there was evidence, and then there were things that science really couldn't talk about because what evidence would there be? I think this is a wonderful example of this relationship between the generalization, the law of gravity, and, at least in the mind of Isaac Newton, a proposed theory of gravity, but it was a non-scientific theory. Now, of course, physicists are working out things like curved space-time and graviton particles, and you physics folks probably know more than I do about this, but of course, scientists are trying to figure out how gravity works. We know that it does work, because you can send a spaceship to the moon and back using Newtonian mechanics. A theory is an explanation for why a law works in the way that it does. So the kinetic molecular theory of matter, perfectly fine theory, related to, you can actually explain quite a lot of the law of molecular motion based upon the kinetic molecular theory. But you see, these are not the same thing. One of them is a generalization, big picture, and the other one is an explanation. That's the theory part. And so one does not become the other. And yet it is very, very commonly taught in US schools that you have a hypothesis, it becomes a theory, and then it becomes a law. If you've ever done that, if you've ever taught that, stop now. I used to teach that. I used to teach that, and I had to go back and find every student I ever taught and tell them I was wrong. Even dictionaries have a problem with this. Sometimes they'll say, you know, when you look up the word law, it will say theory, and if you look up the word theory, it will say law. This is nonsense. This is a very important myth of science, because these are two very important ideas that are not the same. They are related to each other, but one does not become the other. So, myth number 2, hypotheses become theories and then laws. Well, we know the answer to that. It's false. Well, of course, all of the myths are false. This is often taught in schools, and that is my response. Hypotheses may become theories, but they also, depending upon what they are, they might become laws as well. So in the family tree that I showed you a few moments ago, that's why I have the question mark. So the truth is, it depends on whether, where you're headed with your hypothesis, which is one of the reasons, again, why I think this word is a problem. Also very commonly taught in the US, that there is a step-by-step scientific method. You do this, and then you do this, and then you do this, and then you win a Nobel Prize. Wouldn't that be nice? This is the very commonly taught scientific method, and it turns out that the only people who memorize the steps of the scientific method are school kids. Scientists don't work this way. The real way in which science works is far, far more complicated. You don't always start by defining the problem and gathering information, forming a hypothesis, and so forth. It doesn't always start there. So scientists all use careful and appropriate research methods. That's true. Scientists all do that. They record and accurately report data. That's a scientific method that all scientists do. They rely on induction and deduction quite a lot. These logical processes that we've had for centuries, they're really the only logical processes that are useful to us, I suppose, ultimately, and yet there's a flaw with both of them. We will talk a little about the problem of induction. I won't say much about the problem of deduction today. But in any event, if you wanted to say, are there things that all scientists do, the answer is yes. But do they follow a step-by-step method? And the answer is no, no, no. Here's another myth that is very common. Most people think, oh, scientists do experiments. Can you think of a scientist who has never done an experiment?
Einstein.
What was Einstein's claim to fame? He let other people do the actual experiments. He let other people carry equipment to places around the world to look at things like eclipses to try to validate whether his mental ideas were correct or not. But Einstein didn't do experiments. Another one of my favorite scientists who never has done an experiment is Jane Goodall. World famous for her knowledge of chimpanzee behavior. And how did she learn about chimpanzee behavior? She sat and watched the chimpanzees for 25 years. No experiment. She didn't throw a banana and then drag it back. She didn't take the males out and figure out what the females would do. She didn't do it. She sat and watched them for decades. No experiment at all. Qualitative research with that kind of rigor is as good as an experiment would ever be. But of course, a lot of people think scientists do experiments. That is a myth of science. Experiments are planned manipulations of nature designed to show a cause and effect relationship. Oh, experiments are lovely. They're wonderful. They're important. But what's the myth? That all scientists do them all the time. That's the error in our thinking, that there may in fact be other ways to do science, and one of them is 25 years worth of watching chimpanzees in western Tanzania. Some disciplines like geology and astronomy actually lack true experimentation. Imagine an experiment that an astronomer would do. You can't move a star. You have to wait until things happen for you to make whatever observation you want to make. You can't mess with nature. It's just not possible because you can't touch the cosmos and move things around. Many scientists, Copernicus and Kepler, are world famous for interpreting the observations that other people made. You certainly would know that Kepler's work was not really based upon his own observations. His vision was terrible, terrible. But he inherited the observations of Tycho Brahe and was able to interpret them in a whole new way. And of course, Jane Goodall, Charles Darwin, one of my intellectual heroes. Charles Darwin, in fact, did some experiments, but much of his work was observational. I've never noted an experiment in the work of Jane Goodall. I think I'm prepared to say she never did an experiment in her life, especially with the chimps. I wanted to talk a little bit, though, about natural experiments because it's kind of fun. It turns out that sometimes if you were in the right place at the right time, you can observe something very interesting, but you couldn't make it happen. So we'll call these natural experiments. An opportunity for study that presents itself by accident rather than by design. You couldn't make it happen, but it happened and you were there to watch. After the fact, these might look quite a lot like a regular experiment, but if you look at the history, you realize, well, no one could have made that happen. One of the things, probably the only good thing that happened on 9/11, maybe the only good thing, was that some atmospheric scientists realized that over North America, on that horrible day, when every single commercial airplane was told to land, they were ordered to land within an hour. They had to land somewhere. You know, in planes that were flying from New York to California, landed in the middle of the U.S., and they just sat there for 3 days until the government figured out what was going on. It was horrible, of course. But one nice thing that happened was atmospheric scientists realized, oh my gosh, what would the skies be like if there were no commercial airplanes? Well, you just couldn't call the president of every airline company and say, would you mind not flying on Tuesday? We want to study. They would never do that, of course. Commerce always rules over science. But on this particular day, when every commercial airplane was grounded over North America and stayed grounded for about 3 days, we learned a huge amount about how much atmospheric pollution is contributed by commercial airplanes. There were still military airplanes flying, as you could imagine, but they were very few in number compared to the huge number of commercial planes. So this is the day before 9/11. And this is what it looked like the next day. No planes. I was living in California at the time, and I had some colleagues who were in New York for business. They didn't even know whether they could get home. One guy rented a car and drove from New York to California. It took him 4 days because nobody knew at what point the planes would be allowed to fly again. There's a wonderful study that happened in Abu Dhabi when there was an outage in the BlackBerry network. Every BlackBerry phone in the country, in the city of Abu Dhabi, stopped working. And traffic accidents were reduced by 50%. In fact, when they tell you not to text and drive, it's this study that they're citing. Now, you couldn't make that happen, right? You couldn't say to the BlackBerry folks, just turn off your network for a few hours. We want to see what's going to happen. But when the network went down, and it turns out that almost everybody was using a BlackBerry. This was about 10 years ago. We learned a huge amount about distracted driving. Couldn't make it happen, but it happened, so you study it, and then it looks like an experiment after the fact. And of course, one of the greatest ones is the 1919 eclipse. We talked about Einstein a moment ago, used to establish, notice I did not say prove, Einstein's general theory of relativity. It's a 40% decrease. I overestimated by 10%. A 40% decrease in traffic accidents. That's still pretty significant. So there was going to be an eclipse in South Africa and a particular star would be blocked by the eclipse. The star was well known, and it was moving into this realm where this eclipse was going to occur, and people said, you know what, if we could just make that star move behind the sun, then we could study whether in fact there's any bending of the light as the light from the star gets close to our star, the sun. You can't make that happen, but you can wait for it to happen, and that's exactly what happened in 1919. It's an experiment, but it's after the fact. I think most people think that scientists just do whatever they want to. What a great job that would be. You call the government sends you money, you do research, you report it, and then you call the government and ask for more money. Yeah, it doesn't work that way, does it? So scientists, of course, work in areas in which they're interested. But the issue is scientists will be working generally in areas for which they can get funding. So a scientist who's very interested, for instance, in viruses might actually have to work on HIV because that has a particular health component, and the governments around the world would be interested in sponsoring research in HIV/AIDS. And indirectly, you learn more about how viruses operate, and indirectly, you learn more about how the cell functions. But you couldn't get money to do that project. You got money to do something that that the government valued. And so my point is that the work that's done in science in any nation is going to be related to the interests and priorities of that nation. It doesn't mean that scientists can't do what they want, sort of. But there's this, I think there is this myth that, scientists are very, very smart people. They just, they sit in their lab all day and do experiments. Well, that's not true. And they can't necessarily work on exactly what they want to work on because the resources may not be available. We had quite a debate in the United States about stem cell research. Some of you, I'm sure, are aware of this. During the Bush administration, for good or for bad, I don't need to editorialize, there was a ban on most stem cell research. In fact, some of our stem cell scientists in the US were so frustrated they actually went to Singapore because the government wouldn't fund their work. We had a new president, a new idea, a new thought about stem cell research, and now this research is being conducted in labs all across the US. I'm not necessarily saying that's good or bad. I'm simply saying it is what it is. Every country will make decisions about how public money is going to be spent. Funding and cultural priorities play very large roles in the direction taken or not taken in scientific research. This is a negative example. For a period of about 6 to 8 years in the US, there was very little stem cell research done because there was no money for it. And it wasn't as if some rich person could have funded it, but most of the money for this kind of high-level research comes from the central government. Science proves ideas, a very, very common myth. Knowledge production in science is really tricky because gathering evidence is not enough. There's this non-logical step I'm going to talk about in a moment that can turn a bunch of facts into a scientific idea. Just wait on that one for a moment. There's no way to escape what is called the problem of induction. Induction is a fabulous logical process. It's one of the best logical processes that we have, but it's not perfect. There is no way that you will ever have all the information, past, present, and future, to make a decision that you know is going to be true for all time. You've probably seen something like this before. It's sometimes called the arch of knowledge. So you take facts, you collect a whole bunch of facts, and then you form a generalization out of those facts. You can test this is called induction. You can test whether your generalization is valid through a process called deduction. It's impossible to make all of the observations that you would like. It's impossible to collect all the information, past, present, and future. There's no way that you can make observations that are not a bit biased. You're expecting a certain result. This is a very important part of the philosophy of science. It's impossible to guarantee that you will make the necessary leap, called a creative leap, and put all the facts together and make a conclusion that's a valid one. This is an entire chapter in a philosophy book, right there on one page. The problems of induction. So let's talk about induction for a moment. Some of you who perhaps have studied this will recognize this is a very common example. If I see a swan, and it's white, and I see another swan, and it's white, and I see more swans, and it's white, and they're all white, what am I likely to say? Exactly. All swans are white. Now, have I seen every swan? No. Have I seen every swan that is now dead? Have I seen every swan that has yet to hatch? No, no, no. And so, all we can do is say something like, look man, I've seen a lot of swans. Every one I've seen is white. I'm done. I have a law. I call it the law of swans. All swans are white. By the way, it's not true. Even though it's a cool example and it's used in lots of philosophy textbooks, it's not true. They're actually black swans. But if you really thought that all swans are white, if you really, really thought that you had the evidence, and I told you that I had a pet swan in my house, you would say, oh, you have a white swan. You would know that, because all swans are white. Exactly. Oh, some of them disappeared. Oh, they're back there. Okay. However, can we ever prove that all swans are white? Nope. Can we ever prove that all swans are not white? What would it take? They're white. They're still white. Yep, we're good. They're all white. Oh. All you need in science, and we heard this from Paul, the panel discussion this morning, all you need is one counterexample. If you want to say that all swans are white and you find a black swan, or a blue swan, or a green swan, and you know it's a swan, that's another issue by the way, then you would say, oh, I'm done, all swans are not white. It turns out that in biology, unlike in physics and chemistry, we often, though, have to take our laws with a bit of probability statement. We might say something like 93% of swans are white. So if you're gambling and you want to know what color my pet swan is, you would still say, let me see, 93%, I think Bill's swan must be white. By the way, I do not have a swan. I do have a cat named Charles Darwin. So here is a lesson for all science teachers. We cannot talk about proving anything in science. We do not prove things in science, and certainly not in the way that our friends in mathematics do. I've often thought it must be very confusing for a student. You know, they leave science classroom and they go across the hall to geometry where they study proofs. What? We don't do that in science. We do that in math because the rules are different. Hence my point from the panel discussion this morning. Anyway, in science we should be talking about substantiation or support, but we should not talk about proof. Because the problem of induction will make proving something impossible. We can prove something false. We can prove something false, but we cannot prove something true. So proof is a mathematical logical term, cannot be applied in science. It's really much better to say that scientific knowledge is tentative. It could change. But it's durable. It's long-lasting. And another point that I won't discuss in great detail is science is self-correcting. That's really a dramatic element of science. If there's a stupid idea in science, it will not remain for long. Somebody will point it out. Somebody will fix it. A lot of people think that science is not creative. And you know what? I don't blame them. What do we do in school science? What do? We give students a cookbook, we give them a recipe, we tell them you do step 1 and step 2 and step 3 and step 5. We'll see if this joke translates nicely to this audience, but one time I saw a lab guide, and it said, this was the student lab guide, and it said to the student, the color of the blue liquid on the line below. Write the color of the blue liquid on the line below. I mean, I suppose if the student doesn't write blue, you should just, move them right over to the humanities immediately. A lot of people think that science and the arts don't have anything in common, and that's wrong. I told you I wanted to say a little bit about this arch of knowledge again. There it is one more time. But I left something off. When we looked at this 5 minutes ago, I left something off. What did I leave off? The creative spark, the insight, this thing that allows one research group to make a big discovery and another research group doesn't get it at all. Same data, same facts, but somebody had a better idea in one group than in another, and they had this bit of creative thinking that allowed them to move forward. So the truth is that science, it should say science is a creative endeavor. Sorry about that, that's wrong. There's creativity throughout all of science in the selection of problems, the selection of methods of investigation, the degree of prior knowledge, and the important creative spark. There is work done in pedagogy about teaching people to be more creative. Maybe we should teach creativity in schools. Is this lectern for a speaker to stand behind? Is this the only thing we can use this for? Or could it be a ladder? Or could it be a drum? It could be different things if you're creative, but if you're not very creative, it's only for that purpose. There's some very, very good work in psychology done about creative thinking, and it is possible to teach people to be more creative. But it doesn't make much sense just to say, would you please be more creative? You have to be taught how to be a more creative thinker. That would be like somebody saying to me, Bill, couldn't you be taller? No. School science fails to emphasize the creative aspects of science, and that's really unfortunate. Myth 8 out of 10, so we're coming along very nicely here. Scientists are more objective than other people. They're better thinkers. They're clearer thinkers. Nah. Really, scientists are no more objective than anybody else because they have their own personal ideas about what's supposed to happen. I'm sure that even Jane Goodall, once she was watching the chimpanzees for 10 weeks, 50 weeks, 3 years, she was thinking, I know what they're going to do. I know what they're going to do next. I'm sure I know what's going to happen next. That's okay. That's being human. But if they did something unusual, if the chimpanzees did something a little unusual, maybe she would have missed it. Because she was already thinking, okay, I know what's going to happen. They do A and then B and then C. So this bias can actually be a problem in science, but there's nothing we can do about it, except know that it happens. We all observe the world with our own biases and prior conceptions. It's important that we do this. If we're trying to cross the road and we see a bunch of cars coming past, we don't go. But if we see a truck, we know that it's probably coming more slowly, and so we quickly run across the street. If it's a rocket-powered truck, you could be rolled over and killed. But we kind of know that the cars on the street move faster than trucks, and so we time our walk across the street with that in mind. Scientists, of course, have these prior conceptions as well. This is called bias, but the truth of the matter is that bias is a neutral word. In English, it often has a negative feeling, like you shouldn't be biased. I think being biased is very important because if you understand how the world works, then you can make predictions that will probably keep you alive. So I don't quite understand why this word bias has, I mean, it is typically in regular English speaking, it has a negative link. But sometimes our prior conceptions will block our ability to see something useful. We're predicting A and then B and then C, and we missed F. Number 9, science and technology are the same. Well, this will certainly be related to our conversation at the panel discussion this morning. So here we have, of course, Albert Einstein, no introduction needed. This other gentleman you may recognize. He invented the light bulb. This is Thomas Edison. And one of the things that separates these two folks, well, there are lots of things that separate them. They did live at the same time, actually. But one of them was a scientist who really didn't care at all about practical application, and the other one only cared about practical application and didn't really care so much about the science. There is a legend that it took Thomas Edison 1,000 tries to come up with the filament in a light bulb, the little wire that glows. And somebody said to him, Thomas, you wasted so much time. 1,000 times you tried this and that and this wire and this kind of plant, and you're a crazy man, 1,000 times. And he said, no, we didn't waste time. We now know 999 things that do not work. But if he'd truly been a scientist, he would have understood, I think, that some things were better than others. And he might have looked at the material science involved and tried to figure out that, oh, okay, I shouldn't be using these kinds of plants. They never work. I should be using these kinds of materials. They work better. Now, maybe he did some of that. I'm not an expert on the life of Thomas Edison. But this particular quote, that it took him 1,000 times to figure out the structure of the light bulb, is, I think, very interesting. But of course, his entire motivation was a major invention every month and a minor invention every week. We heard our colleague in the back row just before lunch say that Thomas Edison holds more patents than any other person in history. It's still true. As an individual, he holds more patents than any other person who's ever lived. Einstein has 2, I think. Maybe only 1, but Edison has thousands. But one person was interested in science and one was interested in technology. And of course, I could ask the rhetorical question, are these 2 things important? Yes, science and technology are important, but they're not the same. We have to be careful with this in STEM education. So technology makes use of scientific knowledge to achieve a specific purpose. Technologists are more concerned with the application than the underlying phenomenon. Not a surprise. And pure science generates new knowledge for the sake of knowledge alone. That's the end of it. You've solved a problem, whether it's a life-changing important problem or whether it's a fairly minor one. You solve this problem and you have new knowledge. You have no idea what to do with it. The laser, by the way, is a perfect example of this. When the laser was first discovered, there was no purpose for it at all. Later, technologists and engineers found a purpose for the laser. And for a long time, we were all carrying one around in our portable DVDs and CD devices. Now we don't even use lasers for that. It's all digital. Scientists want to know why something functions the way that it does, and that's the end of the story. Science and technology certainly interact with each other, but they should be shown as discrete domains. I probably don't need to say that for the 8th time. There we go. Number 10. There's a bonus one. I lied to you. There's one more I'll share with you. Anyway, scientists and its methods can answer all questions. Some people think that scientific knowledge is so great, so useful, and so comprehensive that we only need science. And I always like to introduce my students to this word, scientism. You may never have heard this word before. I'm not saying scientific, Scientism. Scientism is the belief that you only need science. That's all that you need. But that's probably not true. The raw material of science comes from empirical data provided by experiments and observations, and the data can be shared with other people. Very nice. Anything beyond this kind of data is beyond science. So then the question is, are there some questions that cannot be easily addressed by science or cannot be addressed at all by science? And the answer is most certainly there are questions like that. Moral, ethical, aesthetic, religious questions are often considered to be beyond science. And so they're called metaphysical. Meta meaning beyond the physical. So I always like to ask the question, which of those two paintings is better? Well, it's the Vermeer, of course. Come on. No, if you like the de Kooning, then good. If you like the Vermeer, then good. It doesn't really matter. It's not a scientific question. I could take a vote, but what would that tell us? It wouldn't tell us much. It would tell us that this particular group of people, 60% like one painting, 40% like the other. It doesn't help. I remember reading a book some years ago by Sir Kenneth Clark called What is a Masterpiece?, where he tried to describe why certain paintings are masterpieces. And it was an interesting book, but I thought it was just wrong. It's a masterpiece in the sense if you think it is. And it is really interesting, though, when you go to a big museum like the Louvre. And, for me, it's more fun to watch the people looking at the Mona Lisa than to actually look at the Mona Lisa. I stand, like the Mona Lisa is behind me, and I'm just looking at the people taking pictures, because now they've seen it. They're better people now, because they've seen the Mona Lisa. Good for them. Time magazine, a very important weekly magazine, asked the question, what does science tell us about God? I thought the answer would be nothing. They went on for pages and pages. We could talk about the anthropic principle, but let's not. I don't think science tells us anything about God, because God is in your head, God is in your heart, or God is not there. I mean, it's a personal choice. And so the point being that to try to apply scientific principles to a metaphysical question, is there a God, is there not a God, what is God like, what is God not like, who cares? It's a question of belief, it's not a question of science. And this is my bonus, if you're able to ask the right questions of scientific authorities and different questions of religious authorities, you can have both. Only trouble comes when you confuse the two. And so my bonus question, myth, science and religion are incompatible, I think no. Nothing in science denies the existence of a creator, supreme being, a God. There's not a scientific principle that would say there is no God, despite what Richard Dawkins might say. You can be a scientist and you can be a believer. You can be a scientist and you can be a non-believer. It's all just fine, as long as you ask the right questions of the right authorities. There's nothing in science that proves the existence. There's nothing in science that denies the existence of a creator, a supreme being. So this is one of those debates that I find tiresome. But I do think it's a myth of science. A lot of people think, oh, you're a science type. You're probably an atheist. It's a false assumption. It could be true in the case of an individual, but it certainly isn't true in the case of all scientists. It's impossible to be an effective science teacher without including elements of the nature of science. This should be the message that you take away. You cannot be an effective, complete science teacher if you don't teach aspects of the nature of science. You just can't. Students and teachers, the nature of science that's discussed in science class, though, has to be accurate. So I do think that there will be a lot of science teachers who have some of these myths. So science teachers need to lose the myths, and then they need to incorporate correct nature of science interpretation into lessons. And students and teachers must avoid the myths of science. And with that, I thank you.
A lot of time for questions. 1 second. What about 31? Yeah, okay.
Please. Oh, where are you going?
Dear Professor,
Okay. First, I want to ask you, some researchers, some natural science researchers says, when you test the results of your data, especially in qualitative research, please don't use evidence. Instead of this, please use support or repeat, because evidence is so stubborn.
Well, fair enough.
What do you think about this? This is a myth?
I wouldn't worry about making that distinction, because for me the word evidence just means data. Evidence could be positive,
Yes.
or it could be negative,
Yes.
to support or to refute. So I think maybe these people are being too fussy.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
But you know, we folks in universities like to be fussy.
Thank you. Can I ask
Yes, sure.
a question? At the same time, some natural science researchers, especially who trying to explore scientists, are saying a scientist must help people. They are so nice persons. They give some celestial elements to the scientists. But when we read the history of science, we see some scientists use humans as a guinea pig, like Joseph Mengele, etc. What do you think about this? Are they real scientists?
Well, you've made two very interesting points. One, the scientists, the basic question is that if scientists are using humans in an inappropriate way for experimentation, is that good science or is that bad science? The answer to that question is I don't know. I mean, there are those who say, for instance, that we should use the Nazi data to honor the people who were harmed in these horrible experiments. There are others who would say that we should not use the Nazi data because we do not want to encourage horrible people to do bad things to others. There are others who would say that you should ignore all the Nazi data because it was bad science. I'm not an expert in this area. I don't necessarily have an opinion about which of those three makes the most sense. But I would say that it's not surprising that throughout history there have been nice guy scientists and bad people who were scientists. I mean, I think you could be a bad person and be a good scientist. I don't want to be around them, but I think this could happen. I think this was part of your question. That, you know, I mean, what's the motivation and what's the what ethical response does a person have? What responsibility do they have in doing science? This is a very important question. Very important question. Thank you.
About the second question. Your name and institution, maybe.
sorry?
Your name and institution.
My name is Suma from the University of Bristol. You said science and religion are incompatible, but I know...
As a myth.
Okay.
Yeah.
But some professors at King's College
Yes.
actually
Yes.
are studying science and religion.
Yeah.
And you say there is not a common point, or...
Well, please understand that the point that the way I organized this talk is I put up a statement that was not true. So I do believe that science and religion can coexist. It is tricky Because, of course, religion allows for belief in things that you cannot see. And science teaches that you cannot believe in things that you cannot see. Although we do believe in electrons, I think, but never mind. So, I mean, at some level, there's some fine points there that are worth discussing for more than 5 minutes. But when I give talks like this, I do want people to understand that it is not automatic that, if you're a science person, then religion is out. Or if you're religious, then science is out. I think there is a meeting ground. But of course, we have a very famous book by Richard Dawkins in the last 5 years or so called The God Delusion. Basically, what Dawkins is saying is, not only do I not believe in God, I will tell you there is no God. I have no idea how you would know that. I mean, personally, maybe I'm not sophisticated enough to understand his arguments. I've read his book. I don't think it's helpful. Because for religion is a very important part of the lives of many people. Many people around the world. And it seems to me you can't really get people to understand anything about science if you take the stage and say, all of you folks who are believers, you're all fools. I mean, that would be, pedagogically a terrible way to start. So my notion has been, where is the common ground? I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Is there any other question?
And you all did recognize that we have a little extra time, so the coffee break is still... I know. I don't want to stand between you and coffee or lunch.
Hi, my name is Yalcin Yelaki, and thank you for your presentation. And my question is, you said sometimes scientists, they have an idea of how things work, and they, things happen in the order of A, B, and C.
That's right.
And sometimes, do you think theories might also be the reason for this kind of thinking? Because scientists are, they have an education and they learn theories and laws during their education, and I think it puts them in a framework, and sometimes it becomes difficult to think outside of that framework. So I think I'm asking, there is also a role that theories play.
Of course.
In which they both allow science to develop or advance, but at the same time they limit our thinking.
Yes, well, this word theory is an important one in this context, because we often talk about the ideas that people have before they go out to observe as theory-laden observations. The science education literature uses this particular term. If for instance, that I thought that if I thought that all Turkish food was bad, I just thought this. So my theory-laden observation is Turkish food is bad. And so I go to lunch and I don't even want to try it because I think, oh, it's bad. It's not, right? Okay, we know this. I had a lovely lunch. But this could affect your attitude, it could affect your thinking, it could affect your actions. Yeah. Now you're also saying something else that's very interesting at a really much higher level. By the way, I hate the expression theory-laden observation because I wish we wouldn't use the word theory at all. Just call it bias. You have prior ideas. That's, again, it's sort of like hypothesis. It's a prediction. Just use the word prediction. So in this particular case, though, you could also be talking about the work of Thomas Kuhn. Scientists operate within a shared understanding of what's good science, what's speculative science, what's a useful experiment, what's a useless experiment. So it's called the paradigm. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this concept, that scientists work within a bubble. They share this space with other scientists who do the same kind of work. And that space, that bubble, is called the paradigm. And within that paradigm, there's some theories that are held to be true, and there are others that are invalid, and all of that you take with you. You take your bubble when you do the next experiment. You take your bubble when you make your next observation. It's impossible not to. This is another kind of bias, but it's actually a necessary kind of bias. I said a few moments ago, we all lead our lives based upon yesterday. We are expecting that tomorrow will be like yesterday, unless you had a bad day. I can't help you there. But if every day was completely different from every other day, it would be chaos. What do you wear? How do you talk to people? What do you eat? There's an expectation that things will be the same from day to day. And this is our paradigm. This is kind of a social paradigm. Good question. Excellent two-part question. Nicely done. I can't hear you.
Firstly, thank you for the beneficial presentation. My name is Imran Aral from Necmettin Erbakan University, and I'm wondering your opinions about teaching a science subject, especially if you have some students that every time are interested in Facebook, messaging, and iPads, and which way is the best for these students, and what can you suggest for these students to take their attention and to teaching a science subject? Do you prefer to using a cookbook, a recipe, or a project-based way?
Well, there are a lot of questions there.
Especially, I am wondering your opinions that how can we do to teaching this kind of students?
Well, so your basic question is, how are we teaching a student from the year 2014? A student who has all of this technology and they're distracted by this technology. Is this your question?
My main question is that we have kind of students that they don't interest.
Yes. Yeah, unfortunately, my answer will not be satisfying because I am a realist. I taught for many years. I have no idea how many thousands of students I had when I was a secondary school teacher, and I know that some of them thought I was a fool. They thought science was boring. They didn't like school much either. I don't know what to do about that. I honestly don't know what to do about that. One of the reasons why science is a mandatory subject in most countries is that the adults in the community believe that it is important for students to understand science. How do you help students understand that science is important? It's a very difficult thing, because I will tell you that if I were to say, never lecture's bad, it's a horrible thing, I would be lying to you. I think a good engaging conversation, even if it's mostly teacher talk, is okay. If I would say, never use a cookbook lab, where the step 1, step 2, step 3, but there are times when, if you're teaching a student how to use the microscope, you do not want them to invent a new way to use the microscope. They could break it. So you give them very specific instruction. I think the only answer I can give you is it's about balance. You have to balance your instructional techniques. But there is certainly going to come a time in the life of every teacher where there will be a student you cannot reach. You cannot get to them. I've had those students. You've had those students. Do you stop trying? No. But you may not win. Again, I'm a realist. I think it would be kind of strange for me to say, you can reach every student every day, you'll excite them, they'll love you. No, that's silly.
We are going to have a last question. Just in the back.
Merhaba, Misle Gülbaşar, Mehmet Akif Ersoy Üniversitesi. Ben bir tavsiye almak istiyorum sizden. Bilim tarihi dersini okuturken, bilim tarihi dersi içerisinde sizin Nature of Science'ın çok önemli olduğunu söylüyorsunuz ve bunu sürekli bahsediyorsunuz, bu alanda çalışıyorsunuz. bilim tarihi dersini verirken teknolojilerin gelişimi konusunda nasıl bir yol izlemeliyiz ki teknolojinin de değiştiğini ve doğasını anlatabilelim?
Today we had another question about how to use technology in science. Actually, this is related to that. She's asking how can we use technology while teaching natural science, as it's a very important part of teaching natural science. How can we use technology while teaching natural science or research science?
Well, the good news is, I'm not a huge fan of technology, you may have gathered that already, because sometimes I think it's just distracting. But one of the things that technology has given us, and you all know this, is that the world now can be in this room. You know, if you want to show somebody a page from the first edition of Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, you can go online to the Darwin Project and you can download a facsimile copy of a page from this famous book. You could have it, I could have it in seconds. To me, that's where technology lies. I've given a lot of thought recently to this idea of just-in-time teaching. I think some other people may be using this term as well. It also comes from logistics for stocking a store with a product. You want to make sure that when the customer wants to buy it, the product is there. And so one of the things I typically do with my graduate students, even while I'm lecturing, I've said to them, you know, you can use your devices. I mean, try to stay off social media because we're here for a different purpose, but you can have your device open and ready. And I've often found that my students they'll hear me say something and then they'll do a little excursion. They'll be gone for 2 minutes and they'll investigate something on their own because they were inspired by something that we talked about in class. Another thing that often happens is sometimes I'll say, oh, in what year did Copernicus die? I can't remember. And somebody goes, okay, we have the answer just in time. And so I think that's the best answer that I can give. You can get what you want and get it almost instantly, and it's very, very likely that students will be able to, I'll use the word assimilate, use, process that information when it comes just in time.
Bill, can I ask one question?
No.
The answer would be quite short because more or less I know the answer. But when we look at the next generation science standards, they use natural science to argue, but when we look at it in detail, they prefer to use scientific practices or science and engineering practices, the words. Is it worrying? Well, I assume it's a political decision by the people who made this standard. So, what do you think about this?
Well, there's quite a long answer to this whole question as well. One thing that you might find very interesting is that in the United States, the unit that governs education is not the Federal Ministry of Education. We have a Federal Ministry of Education, as you do, of course. It has a tiny amount of power. The power to govern education in the United States is in each of the 50 states. This was a decision that was made when the country was founded, more than 200 years ago. The right to educate the citizens was given to the states. There are only a few countries in the world that have a system like ours. Germany is similar. Switzerland is a bit similar, but frankly, most of the countries around the world, you have a strong central Ministry of Education, and the curriculum and the standards go to the schools. They go to the regions. They go to the teachers. So we now have this next generation science standards, but they're only a suggestion for the states. It's not a federal project. It was done by a bunch of researchers. So I'm not even sure where the politics come in, except to say, obviously, the engineering group was very interested in getting engineering education into the schools. I wish that they had proposed their own standards for engineering education such that they would not have been a burden on the science curriculum. But what may happen is that as individual states either reject or accept the use of these next generation standards, that they may be modified in some fashion. I actually think that we call them next gen, as the next gen standards are used and examined, I think they're going to be very complicated to put into practice. Very complicated indeed. There are 4 basic elements that every lesson is supposed to have: science and engineering in it, science content, big themes, and nature of science. Imagine, it's like juggling, where the teacher has to say, wait, I've done the big themes, now I'll do some content, now I'll do some nature of science. I think it's going to be very difficult to see it happen in the way in which the designers intended. And of course, you could imagine now that you've seen my thought about this step-by-step scientific method. I don't want a list of how to do science. I don't even want a list of how to do engineering, although I'm not an engineering educator. But I think lists like that are very damaging to the creative spirit of science and engineering. So that will be, thank you for giving me that opportunity.
Thanks a lot. We do appreciate your great talk. And now we have a 15 minutes coffee break. After that, formal session will start. And I think what we are missing, I'd like to thank the organizer of the conference. It has been great success actually. Thanks for Ahmet and Ismail and their teams. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. I will do that when I get home.
Benim şeyimi duymadım.